advisor is Mary Helen Specht, and I invite you to the stage. Camryn, let's give her a hand.
So Texas is not only a state, but a unique region in and of itself. Not completely fitting into the boundaries of the South or the West, individual subcultures are defining themselves by the land and the people around them, thus making their own distinctions. Finding uniformity throughout the state is all but impossible, but I sought to discover how the unique history and culture of Texas created a pattern of Southern and Western literature within its borders to make a place of its own. On the topic of place, Texan writers exemplify the notion of pride, often writing regionally to appeal to the people from their homes. This raises the question of how writers choose to reflect their region and the ways in which they integrate a strong sense of place, especially in areas as regionally unclear as Texas is. In applying my research, I wrote 4 short stories set across varying time periods, from the Reconstruction all the way to the late 20th century. Each story is set in a specific region of Texas, and it follows that region's cultural and literary traditions. So first, in a presentation about regionalism, I have to define what regional literature is. Scholar and writer Mary Austin makes a distinction between literature that is regional and literature that's just set in the region. In doing so, she identifies 2 defining characteristics, those being setting is more than a backdrop, and region as an independent character. Place cannot simply be a setting. Place must be inextricable from the story, thus becoming a character in and of itself. This is because genuine regionalism does not play on the presuppositions one may have about a specific area. Rather, the people of the area must be able to identify with it. If they can't see themselves within the story, they have to be able to see their uncle, their friend, or their neighbor. So now I'm going to give a brief synopsis of each of my stories. My first story is called Little Miss Lenora May, and it is set in the South Texas town of Pleasanton in 1869. In this story, 7-year-old Lenora has big dreams of becoming a deputy like her father and grandfather before her. She realizes, however, that her town is no longer safe when it is raided by a band of Tonkawa Indians. To prove herself as a deputy, she feels that it is on her to save her town and stop the Tonkawa raids. My second story is set in Kittikay, a West Texas town, in 1903. In this story, a young man, Walter, grew up and works on the Lazy F Ranch, owned by famous rancher Charles Goodnight. He is forced to flee into the Caprock Canyons when he unintentionally kills a fellow ranch hand. Once he reaches the canyons, he meets an old Comanchero who guides him through the Caprocks and teaches Walter a little bit about himself. My next story is titled Cotton Season, and it is set in the West Texas town, Central Texas, now non-existent town of Theon in 1943. It follows the story of young couple Paul and Edie as they face the looming World War II draft, recovering from the Great Depression, and go through a miscarriage together. Through the support of their family and their community, they're able to find a sense of comfort and I was going to say solitude, but that's not the right word, so we're just going to go with that. And my last story is titled The Funeral. It's set in the East Texas town of Palestine in 1990. In this story, a man, Paul, returns home for his father's funeral 15 years after being kicked out. Once he returns home, he must make the decision between paying a debt owed in his new life and staying home and trying to reestablish a connection with his sister and her new fiancé. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of the distinction between Southern and Western literature. There are many subgenres of Southern literature, from the plantation novel to Southern Gothic. But for the purposes of this project, I chose to focus on pastoralism. This type of Southern literature is best described by the Southern Agrarians in their 1930 manifesto, I'll Take My Stand. The framework for most following writings, it focuses on the importance of provinciality and community. Agrarian life is idealized, and conflict was centered around individuals finding their place within the bounds of their community. In reflecting my Southern, or in general, East and Central Texas tend to identify with the South. With historically agrarian economies, their culture aligns more with the traditional South because this is tied back to the antebellum period for the East in particular. Having faced the impacts of the Civil War and the Reconstruction, lower to middle class people historically led lives characterized by scarcity, want, and a sense of betrayal. This caused these areas to feel a closer tie to community, finding identity within the tightly knit culture of their own town, religion, or heritage. In applying ideas of Southern literature to my stories, I tried to integrate all the different ways a person could find identity within their community. So I will be reading a brief passage from cotton season. Up until 2 weeks prior, Edie and Paul had only talked about children briefly, something to be concerned about only in the distant future. Now is not the time to bring a child into the world. Edie's father passed in what was believed to be a stroke last year. Paul's brother, Charles, had been drafted to fight in the war only a few months prior, leaving behind a wife and 2 girls. Though there were only 30 people within town, the surrounding rural families and neighboring towns numbered almost 500. Of these, Edie knew of at least 10 men who had gone off to serve. 2 of them were not coming back. She was sure they were cruelly picking people from small towns by hand. There were no large factories here. Agriculture was primarily self- or community-sustaining. They had nothing to contribute to the war effort besides their bodies. Every relatively young man in their community was at risk of being the next to go, and it was hot on the mind of each family. The next round would result in someone's son, father, or brother being hauled overseas. Of course, a draft could be deferred through work in agriculture, among other things, but support for the war effort was high. To defer a draft could make you the talk of the town, especially in Theon, where more than half the population came from some German heritage. If you deferred the draft, you may be no better than a Nazi. On the West, on the other hand, is centered around ideas of exploration and adventure. The written version of history's manifest destiny, the Western literary genre is tied to masculinity, violence, and triumph over enemies and the land. Westerns feature a character, often a young man, leaving his home in search of fame, wealth, or power. Traditionally, these characters do gain such, but not without a fight. South and West Texas are more affiliated with the Western genre, not sharing the same agrarian history as their counterparts. Entrenched in conflict along the Mexican border and with Native Americans, settlements were less established, leading to a shallower sense of community. Rather than working with the land to grow crops, they were in conflict with each other, wildlife, and nature. A specific theme that I would like to focus on is landscape, particularly as it applies to Westerns. Naturalist writer Carol Culler reflects on the experiences of country kids and how they are more in tune with the land and nature around them. They were raised to work with nature and are accustomed to being in harmony with it and attuned to its benefits and its dangers. She writes both fondly and critically of the land surrounding her, describing its almost dangerous beauty. In Westerns, landscape can either work with or against its characters. In general, settlement of the West is a form of conquering, taming what was otherwise wild and free. The landscape, however, can also serve as an antagonist, and sometimes an attempt to settle the land turns into simply trying to survive it. So in applying ideas of landscape to my stories, I really tried to juxtapose the very real and imminent dangers that the landscape provides with the perceived dangers of those around the characters. So I will be reading from the Caprock Comanchero. When the strange man had told Walter his camp was down a ways, he surely couldn't tip. Walter found himself navigating the steep canyon trails with the grace of a newborn calf, while the man, despite the butt leg, appeared to have no trouble at all. Tall patches of Indian grass scraped against his legs, causing a terrible itching. He resisted the urge to scratch, however, for to lean over would be to take his eyes off the man. They were no longer on the canyon's edge. They were deep in its belly, slowly being swallowed. Shadows from the canyon walls loomed, yet Walter didn't mind the reprieve from the deadly Texas sun. They had crossed some ledges that were a tighter fit than what he might have found comfortable, and he knew that if the man truly meant to kill him, he would have done so already. If not with the knife, he could have easily just shoved him off the ledge. Another theme that I want to touch on is that of continuity, particularly in a southern landscape. Writer John Graves mentions continuity when he recounts his experience restoring an old farm. While working on a tractor, he finds himself wishing that previous generations had done a shoddier job so that the work would be easier for him to take apart. This introduces ideas of generations of compiled work and care. In Southern art, but particularly in Southern literature, generations build on each other, each making the conscious decision to stick with their roots and their family. In doing so, they build something harder to tear apart. In applying the idea of continuity to my stories, I knew that I wanted to think of all the different, I wanted characters to make the conscious choice to stay in their community, to continue the Southern tradition. I didn't want them to be there just because that's where they ended up, or that's how it's always been. I wanted it to be a plot device and a decision. So, I will be reading from the funeral. For those who remained at the funeral, the wake was held back at the house. After his eulogy that wasn't, Cole decided it would probably be best to steer clear and let everyone have their gossip. At least he would avoid the stares and the whispers. So, he stood in the front yard, flask clearly in hand. He had an image to maintain after all. When he was sure everyone was getting distracted, he slipped away to the garage to grab the Colt. Wrapping it in an old cloth that was sitting on the shelf, he tucked it into his jacket, then made his way to Danny's yellow truck. He probably could have just asked for the keys, but he figured hot wiring it would get the job done just as good, for old time's sake. Just as he got it started, he saw Catherine's face in the window, red and teary. As he threw the truck into reverse, she stormed to the doorway. "Call, what the hell are you doing? Call." Call turned the truck and sputtered down the driveway into the road. In the rear view, he could see his sister storm inside. He made his way through the streets of the familiar town and pulled into the lot of a brick building with a large yellow sign up front. A while later, Call left the pawn shop with just shy of 10 grand in his pocket. Getting the truck started again, he turned onto the main road and back the way he came. Bookie be damned. That was a problem for later, if ever. For now, he knew one thing. His sister would not be losing her home. He would not lose his. Not again. A final genre that I want to touch on is that of the Southwestern. While not perfect, this one probably most closely aligns with the broadly Texan history and culture. In the Southwestern, the South is to settlement as the West is to expansion. Like in the Western, a character is often featured leaving his home in search of fame, wealth, or power. But instead of being met with that, they are met with hardship and loss of self, life, family, money, anything in between. And the Southwestern introduces an interesting idea, that being the dangers of the worship of place, that I really wanted to apply in my stories. That being, no place is, in writing regionally, it's very easy to fall into a one-sided, unilateral view of any given region. However, no one place is perfectly good, nor is it perfectly evil. And that's something that I really tried to reflect in each of my stories. So I will be reading from Little Miss Lenora May. The main street was buzzing with activity, horses popping through and children playing. Yells echoed through the streets, and Lenora wished that they would just be quiet. She would never be able to hear the Comanche possum with all this ruckus. The noise grew louder and louder, whoops and hollers that sounded familiar yet unmistakably foreign. Whistles and screams rose and fell, and Lenora could suddenly sense something was terribly wrong. She gripped her loaded slingshot tighter and crept through the back door of the bakery. The smell of burning bread filled her nostrils. "Mr. Martin," she called out. Though outside was filled with yelps and wails, inside the bakery was eerily quiet. Hearing the screams, something inside Lenora had told her to stay as low to the ground as possible. She crouched into a squat and shuffled her way behind the counter, intending to reach the kitchen. The moment she rounded the corner, however, she froze. A man she recognized to be Mr. Martin by his apron and straw-colored hair lay face down on the ground, arrows sticking out of his legs and his back. So there's one final idea that I would like to close on, that being writing what you know. Successful writer of Westerns, Elmer Kelton, grew up on a ranch in West Texas. While a student at UT, he was told by a professor that he could never be taken seriously as a writer so long as he wrote about Texas ranch life. Serious literature took place in French villas or the English countryside. Kelton consistently writes about this perceived lessened validity of rural America, particularly in academia. He ascribes this to the fact that many people who have active, powerful roles in academia come from the same academic backgrounds. Colleges and universities are generally located in urban areas, the most prestigious of which being along the East Coast. The location of these colleges furthers this perception of southern areas, rural areas being other, being separate, being unworthy of discussion in academic settings. However, Kelton consistently rejected this idea, continuing to write about ranch life, about the West, and he became an immensely successful author because he wrote what he knew, what he knew, and he was able to write it authentically. Now I'm going to talk just a little bit about myself. I am a 7th generation Texan. I grew up just north on 35 in Williamson County. My family history is laced with sheriffs, Texas Rangers, farmers, and everything in between. I grew up hearing stories about crime fighting and feuding families, and these were some of my first experiences with storytelling. These are the stories that taught me to write and the ones that I can most authentically tell. Obviously, I went to college in Austin, and at St. Edward's, my experience, as I'm sure it would at many comparable universities, validated Kelton's idea that those who choose to express their Southern or their rural identity are viewed as less worthy. Their words have less power, their opinions have less meaning. Because of this idea of the South, the rural South, not being worth academia's time. But the fact is, rural stories have value. This is seen in Larry McMurtry in his successful novel, Lonesome Dove. It's seen in successful TV shows such as Gunsmoke and Walker, Texas Ranger. It's seen in the resurgence of authentic country and Western music. The fact is that rural stories have value. Our food comes from ranchers and farmers. Portions of our natural landscape are preserved by private, multi-generational ownership. Our cars run because of oil field workers, and our infrastructure is made possible by welders and fabricators. Rural people experience love and loss just as those who live in castles do. Texas' rich history only provides an added level to these stories. We have the Alamo and we have Whataburger. We are home to the Llano Estacado and the Galveston Bay. The stories of true Texans are worth telling, and these Texans deserve an authentic, well-rounded telling of them. Good writing is good writing, no matter where it is said. The fact that a story is regional only means that it serves as a mirror to those who don't often get to see themselves in the things that they do.
Thank you so much, Camryn. I'm going to invite Mary Helen Spence up to say a few words about Camryn.
I'm Mary Helen Speck, and ever since Camryn first took a fiction workshop with me, I quickly learned that not only was she smart and hardworking and creative, but she also had a very strong point of view, a very strong sense of herself and her identity. I think you can see that in this presentation. A lot of the writers I work with, we're working on crafts, developing technique, but one of the things that I love about Camryn's work, and that I hope you can see through the excerpts she read, is not only does she have the chops, but she also really has something to say. So I'm very proud of her, and honored to be a small part of her thesis project. So congratulations.
I want to read every story that you talked about. I want to know what happened. But let's open it up for questions from our audience. We have about 5 minutes for questions or comments.
How did you choose the towns that you choose?
So it was a little bit of so some of them, for example, Theon is right next to the town where my grandparents live and part of where I grew up. It's not existent anymore, but you drive by it, you see it, it's familiar to me. Pleasanton is in the same county, is where a lot of my family is from. A lot of my family's from Atascosa and Wilson County. My family has a ranch down in Atascosa, and I was going to set it in a different town in Atascosa originally, but there's a sheriff in the story, and Pleasanton is the county seat, so it wouldn't really make sense to have it in a different place in the county. Palestine was just kind of a random choice, honestly. I'm not super familiar with East Texas, and I knew someone who's from there. And then Kittikay is because originally I knew I wanted to use the Caprock Canyon specifically, and Kittikay was one of the towns that's history really intrigued me because the Lazy F Ranch in Charles Goodnight, that's actually a real piece of history. The Lazy F Ranch was right outside Kittikay. It was owned by rancher Charles Goodnight, and there's a lot of stories there. So.
Do you have any non-Southerners as characters in your story, as foils or anything, or how does that work with regional?
With the Westerns, yes, there's some integration of non-Southern characters, a lot of different cultures, like the Mexican culture, the Native American culture, there's a lot of integration of that. but not so much with the Southern stories, just because it's more focused on the ideas of within the community. Although I will say there is a lot of focus on German heritage and German immigrants within the cotton season story.
I think I'm glad to hear the excerpts of your stories today. We never heard before. That's awesome. And I think we can catch glimpses of how much rich research you did for this. Could you just share some of the, I mean, I know you mentioned McMurtry and Graves and Kelton. Are there any other authors or research that you did that informed your project?
Camryn Porter was a big part of it. I did that research paper on Camryn Porter for your class last year, and that was a big, like, those, less of like the content, but more the style in which she writes was a big inspiration for me. And then another thing that I didn't really get to touch on in my presentation is using the origins of the Western, such as the Virginian, and applying it to my stories. Because the Western is actually originated in Eastern ideas where men were working more at desk jobs, they were more inside, and doctors began diagnosing them with what they call the nervous disposition, which they said it was like, oh, you're inside too long, you're not doing manly things, so you're getting this nervous disposition. So for treatment, you need to go west, you need to explore, you need to conquer the West, and then come back and write about your experiences. So Owen Wister, the author of one of what's considered to be the first Western novel, The Virginian, was one of those people who was sent west for his nervous disposition. So then in my stories, in the Caprock Comanchero, my main character suffers from the nervous disposition, and it's the reason why he ends up accidentally killing the fellow ranch hand in the first place.
We have time for one more question or comment. Anybody else?
Your artwork was beautiful.
Okay, I do have one I'm
Yes.
dying to ask you. Where do you talked a lot about the bias that we often see in academia, and I would also argue in the publishing world, against regional literature, against some Southern voices, Texas voices, Westerns in general. Where do you see this collection going? How much of it have you written? Are you in the process of trying to publish it? And do you think, how will you go about that? How will you counter that kind of bias you may receive?
So I am mostly done with the collection. I still have some, like, micro level edits to make and one story to flesh out a little bit more. But honestly, writing is not going to be my career path. I'm going to law school, so this is more like I enjoyed the thesis, but it's also a lot for like my personal curiosity and my personal research. So I'm not sure it's going to leave my computer, to be honest.
That's amazing that you just did a side project story collection with this, like, so much research behind it, so much thought. I'm very impressed. Any last thoughts? All right, well, thank you so much.